Welcome, friends, to the Pioneers of the Independent Networks. I'm your host, Ricky Blues. This is your co-host, Tim Walker. And friends, if you joined us in the past, you know that we bring you the characters, the matches, the promoters, the promotions, the feuds that populated the Mid-Atlantic independent wrestling scene from the 1980s through the 2000s. Tim, that's 4 decades of material that we talk about on this show.
Wow, it makes us seem very old.
We are long in the tooth.
Yes, we are. And we're willing to admit it. So pass me the Geritol.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So, Tim, where are we coming from this week?
We're coming from Cronridge Drive in Owings Mills, Maryland.
Was that the headquarters of anything particular?
I think so.
What could that be?
UIW, I think.
Universal Independent Wrestling Headquarters. Wow, that's a throwback. So that kind of harkens to what our topic is this week. And we're going to put together, for Season 3, a what-if scenario. And the scenario is simply this. UIW and the Maryland hotbed that became the Mid-Atlantic hotbed was the almost. They were the runners-up. What if it wasn't ECW that set that spark? What if it was what grew out of UIW? Because it was very, very close. Tim, what do we have to support our what-if scenario? And what are some of the things that we should be talking to the fans about to just point how close we really were?
Well, I really do agree. That was a near miss. That it was that close. Just a few years later, ECW caught that spark, and it went national. UIW had a lot of the same characteristics that ECW had. They had local television.
Right.
They had a radio show.
Right.
They had a talented and skilled group of wrestlers.
Exactly.
They had a very talented booker.
100%. Someone who understood the business and had experience in the business with TV and with some of the combustible elements that made it grow, and actually was part of ECW for a period of time.
That's great. And a developing fan base, I think.
Right. We had a couple things that were right there, that were the exact same things that ECW had, and I think we should flesh those out for the fans. Now, we should always start with, I think, my opinion, the people behind the scenes. Not just the wrestlers and workers, but the guys and girls who brought it together, who fostered the idea, and showed us how to grow that. So I would start with the promoter / booker, Ed Zahn, and then his staff, his right-hand man, the staff member, Jeff Capo, which later grew into Win a little bit more. I think we start there. What do you think?
I think that's a real good idea.
So let's talk a little bit about Ed. From what we've experienced firsthand. Does that sound good?
Sounds like an idea to me.
Okay. So we know that Ed had an in the professional wrestling business that started in Pennsylvania.
That's right.
And he grew a small promotion with one person, very talented guy, Bounty Hunter,
right,
which was the Atlantic Wrestling Federation.
Right.
They brought in some big names. They developed some local talent. They put on some really good shows, and they got a TV spot.
They had a very good quality promotion.
And it was done in a professional manner. It was very close to what happened in UIW. So Ed parlayed that experience that he developed in Pennsylvania, brought it into Maryland, married up some more talented people behind the scenes, got with the Gambos, who were running a television, I guess, school, for lack of communication school, for lack of better terms, that was teaching television techniques, and they started off and running. Now, before we got with the Gambos, and that turned into us getting WJZ, Channel 13, local television, which was the state of the art at that time on how wrestling shows were done on local television. That's where you built your fan base.
That was the ABC affiliate in Baltimore.
At the ABC affiliate, right? We also, prior to that, we started a promotion, ASWA. ASWA ran about 6 shows. They shot them for film, and we had about 6 shows in the can that went to Home Team Sports. Home Team Sports would be today's equivalent of the Masson Network.
Right.
And we gave that a shot. And it fell a little short, and they needed to grow from there. So they started to put a little bit more things in place. Now, the one thing that I think came a little bit too late in the promotion for UIW that was going to move us in the right direction was some name recognition. Because I think we went a little bit too far into the TV time, maybe 12 weeks into TV time, before we actually had a name show up. And that first name that I think we brought in was Cactus Jack.
Right.
So I think we went a little bit too long in exposing the bigger names and bringing people along to see that, hey, we're building something. ECW didn't. They were able to do that to a degree as Eastern Championship Wrestling. But there's a lot more ties there, too.
I do think you're right about the national name. That would draw some recognition to the promotion. It would also give the local wrestlers interaction with the big names that are recognizable on a national level. I think you want to make it look like everyone on that roster was a AAA player,
right,
but had the potential to be moved up to the main roster. I think if you brought someone in like Cactus Jack on a regular basis and had more of an interaction with all the talent, I think that would have helped a lot.
Help develop the talent a little bit more. Polishing is what I guess the word that we would use. Now, for Ed with UIW, in his AWF days, when they were running television, they had a 2-pronged monster that was pretty good. They brought in Joel Goodhart. Joel Goodhart was a radio personality in Philly.
Yes.
Philadelphia is a big market place. That is a big market town. So when you start espousing things about your professional wrestling business in a big market town, you're going to have a draw.
Right.
So
and Joel also had a fan club.
Yes, he did.
Who followed him when he did his ring announcing jobs throughout the area in Pennsylvania.
And it helped it grow. Ed windowed into that early. We tried to mirror that because in July 1991, Larry Katz went live on WCBM?
WCBM
680 AM, July of 1991, goes live, and Larry was doing very much the same thing, much like Joel was.
Right.
Larry would show up at different events and be the MC, the ring announcer, and he would also take the talent to the radio.
Right.
For different interviews and those types of things. But it just wasn't the same. It was there. It had the potential. 680 was a high wattage radio station that drew a good crowd, that drew a lot of listeners and helped move in that right direction.
Joel was probably a little bit better as far as developing characters through his radio show and move the stories a little bit forward.
He had a couple more layers to him than just the radio station. Right. Joel was also doing some TV announcing for the AWF at the time. And I think, too, with that fan club that he had, there was a lot more interaction on that fan level.
Right. I think the fans took him a little bit more seriously, especially because he had a lot of ties in the industry, as far as being able to organize trips to Memphis,
right,
and that sort of thing, and such as him working with Jerry Lawler on Fan Club Week. He also had like a really good relationship with Jim Cornette, if I remember correctly.
The bus trips to Memphis.
Right.
So he wasn't just, and not to speak bad of, but Larry was just part of. He filled a role. Joel not only filled a role, but brought people along with him. There was many more layers to what he was involved in. His just wasn't one part. He brought the promotion with him.
And Joel actually brought people
right
to Philadelphia and set up luncheons and stuff like that. If I recall correctly, he set up a big luncheon for Ric Flair's 40th birthday.
40th birthday. Yep.
So he really had some credibility behind him. Joel came off as a really big wrestling fan who was on the radio, as opposed to Larry, who I thought was more of a radio personality who did wrestling.
Took a cup of tea in the wrestling business. I agree.
And in Larry's defense, too, he was on late at night.
Right.
So he had a different audience than Joel had, being on at 8 o'clock in the morning. Larry was on between 10 and 12, and then later on I think he moved after the midnight hour.
Right.
And it definitely is a different audience to try and draw listeners in that late at night. So I thought that was perhaps Larry's attempt to be more entertainment-oriented and draw in not necessarily a real hardcore wrestling audience, but be entertaining and be light and have people tune in very late in the evening. But the local wrestling scene really did have to thank Larry for that time. He would set aside a period of time where he would devote just to the local wrestling scene, and he would have different local wrestlers, some who weren't quite all that polished,
Right.
on the air. And I think maybe that was good and bad at the same time, because the presentation of the character sometimes didn't quite match what was going on the air. And I thought maybe that was not the best.
And for me, that windows into what my next point would be, and that is this. When Max Thrasher, Axel Rotten, Ed Zahn, Jeff Capo, and the Gambos did their brain trust, I guess, if you would, to develop storylines, we started to put things in place. And we started to develop stories. And at first, those stories were very entrenching. They drew you into what was going on. That's the hallmark of experience in the wrestling business. But when the brain trust separated and Ed and Jeff realized, hey, wait a minute, everybody doesn't have everybody else's best interest at heart, and they moved along, that storyline just completely fell off. And I think because the way that those stories abruptly ended, like the Golden Phoenix and Max Thrasher sagas, completely just ended, really threw wrestling fans off. If they'd have been able to allowed to flesh out to their proper ending, I think maybe we could have had that next level, because we were right there. We had everything in place to go to that next level.
I think you're right about that. I think missing key elements of the story kind of extinguished that spark.
The flame that was going, instead of letting that flesh out, because you could have, if you've done that and then at that time brought in some of the, or taken the names that you should have introduced earlier and infuse those with the storylines once you've developed who your champions were, because that was the big storylines. You develop them, you make them your local people. That's who you're pushing. And then if you've already introduced the name talent in week 2, week 3, week 4, and all of a sudden when week 12 rolls around and you've now through your tournament been able to crown your champions, it gives you a much more broader area to infuse the name talent with your champions, the ones that you're heralding, and it does one thing. It provides them more legitimacy. It enables people to look at and say, wow, I'm reading their names in these magazines, and they are on the same level as the NWA champion, or they're on the same level as the WWF champion. And look at the competition that they're facing. I think that is where the downfall happened, and we weren't able to make that next step. And what I'll use to help me support that, and I'll throw this right back to you because this is your medium, I want you to think about all the press that we got at that time through the printed press, the paper press, which was one of the biggest key elements that you needed. Think about all the stories that were out there that put the Max Thrasher on the same level as Don Morocco's, or as Bam Bam Bigelow's, or as the Honky Tonk Man. And Ricky Blues, putting him on the same level as the 1-2-3 Kid, or as Chris Benoit, who was coming through. That was all covered, and it was there. The ingredients were there, but I thought they'd come a little bit late. But talk a little bit about that printed press and what that did for us.
I think that really helped at the beginning, but I never think it was fully actualized. I think it did come later, especially when Julie Blanton came on the scene, and the people in charge really gave Julie the ball, and she ran with it. But that was after the UIW had already gone its course.
And that was in the the WIN period. She was brought into the Brain Trust through Ed and through Jeff.
I thought that was a brilliant move on
because she
their
worked
parts.
hard. She was a
did.
hard worker.
She was working hard. She'd be sending faxes to different magazines, different editors. She kept on them all the time.
Right.
She's a very good liaison with the press.
That was extremely important. If you pull out any of the magazines from that 1990 to like 1994 time period, and it's not just relegated like today to the arena report section, I'm telling you, we had pinups, centerfold pinups, we had feature articles in the big magazines, the Kappa Press, the Big Four, and then all the other small market mags that were out too. We're covering like Wrestling Fury and Wrestling Arena and those types
Wrestling's
of
Main
publishing.
Event did a very good job too.
They did.
They did a good job in developing the characters, like Rasta the Voodoo Man, something that they saw that was very interesting in a character. They would actually take the time and write a story about that, and it was very interesting, I think, for the fans all over the country to be able to read about a character and identify with it. I think PWI did a very good job with
100%.
that, especially in their top 500 when they would rate the local wrestlers. A lot of people get really concerned about that rating, like who's number 246 versus who's number 255. Really, I don't think that's necessarily the point of having those 500 ratings. It's actually introducing characters to the wrestling fans and having your picture published in a magazine.
Well,
and with a little bit of background information.
And the
about you.
background information to do one thing. Remember, when you get into this wrestling business, it is not a sprint, it is a marathon. So you introduce that person at number 383 in 1991. And then you realize as the evolution of that character develops, and you've got a little bit of his background, come 1993, 1994, the next years, and you're seeing them move up, you're being trained to understand that this person is elevating. They're coming into their own and they're developing more. That's part of the psychology of what is behind the concept in wrestling magazines. That is to continue to develop those characters, to breathe life and show the breadth of them.
And Julie found out to be important because it would give the promotion legitimacy.
100%. So you can see with just those few elements, and we're going to talk more in a second, but you can just see with those few elements just how close we were.